Thank you, Trishman, for giving me the opportunity to speak about my forthcoming book from Jawaharlal University Press this summer. It's been a long time coming because I finished my PhD in 2001, and this is the book that comes out of my PhD finally. Um, it's more or less what I did in my PhD work, but with some substantial changes. The introduction and conclusion will, of course, be different, as well as there is an annex on cinema in Burma, which I wrote about and will be part of this book. When the thesis was written, it was in film studies, in Indian film studies, possibly the first archival based historical work on the history of Indian cinema at that point. Most of the archival work for Indian cinema had been done by scholars of censorship, but this was probably the first piece of work that came out as an archival historical kind of documentation of the film industry. So in that sense, it was quite well received at that point in time. It was also important because the films that I was talking about, early Indian cinema that it traces 1896 to 1936, weren't available. So most of the history had to be reconstructed from paper sources, which included, in some senses, the governmental records, but also a lot of newspaper scanning, and then all kinds of other documents like streetcars of Bombay and so on, and then finally the film magazines for the later period that were available at the National Film Archives of India in Pune. So in short, the book traces the beginnings of the Bombay film industry and from 1896 to 1936. So it needs to be specified that when we talk about the Bombay film industry, I was making an intervention that the film industry actually began before Indian films were produced, in the sense that we had to take into account the kind of film culture that had been produced in Bombay through watching imported cinema for about almost like 2.5 decades before Indian cinema finally took flight in the 1920s. It was very important to specify because a lot of money that was made from the exhibition trade of imported cinema finally went into producing the first studios in Bombay. So it was quite literally instrumental, this period where there was no Indian cinema per se being shown, but films were being watched in large numbers. This phase was very important in the setting up of the film industry as such. Well, to give a very general kind of drift of how the work turned out to be, at one level it is a very documentation heavy book, in the sense that I documented all the films that were being shown, made, the studios, locations of exhibition sites like cinema halls, audiences and things like that. So at one level it is primarily a book that gives you information about the birth of the Bombay film industry. Secondarily, I think one of the interesting things that came out during my work was that very soon the Bombay film industry spread its wings and started to depend on a region like Punjab for its finances, because a lot of the money from exhibition started to come from the Punjab, where there was a huge demand for cinema. And that became a very integral part of my thesis. And over time, this relationship with Punjab and then Maharashtra and Bengal turned into a kind of synergistic relationship in terms of film production as well. Studios, actors, directors started to kind of travel between these regions from one part to another, and most importantly into Bombay. So these trans-regional networks became very important over time, say from 1925 onwards. but in the 1930s they became crucial to the birth of Indian cinema as such, in a certain sense. The third thing that was important, I think very important, was locating this film industry in something called the Bazaar, and seeing this Bazaar also as a sort of urban history. An urban history that is located in this period in the 1920s between imperial histories and global histories, in tension with one another. What is great about the Bazaar is that the Bazaar, in some senses, bucks bucks historical periodization. The Bazaar is a space where various cascades of previous histories come together and coexist with contemporary history. So the Bazaar cannot be specified as specifically a colonial thing, but has layers of histories coming from earlier periods, most importantly from the Mughal period. So it's imperial in a double sense, the Mughal and the British colonial. And that produces an interesting tension and modernization of earlier genres, both in literature, oral literature, and then cinema, which I think was very, very crucial. The final point that became, in fact, the polemical point about my dissertation was with the coming of the talkies, with the coming of sound, the whole culture of cinema making in Bombay changes. Sound brings in the middle classes in a big way because with sound, the middle classes bring in their modernized Indian languages into the industry, and that completely changes the nature of film production in Bombay. In the silent period, adventure romance cinema derived from all kinds of sources, from the Arabian Nights to the Qissa Dastan to Hollywood imported action adventure serials to The Thief of Baghdad. They were very, very important. They were the main, in fact, component of Bombay film production, say between the 1920s and 1931 or 34, when silent cinema film production stopped. That whole focus on action, adventure, and romance shifted towards the social cinema as a genre with the coming of the middle class and sound. I think the transformation has huge implications for general modern Indian history, which I think I shall delineate at length now in my introduction and conclusion. One of the things is that one must remember that this action adventure cinema was being made directly, almost indexically, in the sites where an older Mughal imperial structure was coming to an end, which is the princely states of Gujarat, the Rajput princely states, and Saurashtra. So actually this cinema was a documentation of the demise of the Mughal Empire, quite literally. The horses, the actors who were wrestlers coming from various princely states, above all the actresses, the courtesans, who became a very important part of the film industry. These were all vestiges of an older imperial order, which of course had been transformed with colonialism. But what this cinema then caught was the end of this. And it is this world, the transformation of this imperial order into the modern, which the talkies bring about. All that we see in the talkies is the transformation of these older imperial elite, land-holding elites, into becoming middle-class subjects without recourse to a fantasy of martial glory or control over land or the patronage of popular culture, which gets taken over by mainly the local politician and the Indian state in a certain sense. So the earlier mercantile imperial patronage of culture located in the Bazaar, which was very cosmopolitan because the Bazaar brought in goods, people, performance styles, genres from all across the world and from all regions in India in one space. That carnivalesque world gets replaced because of the shift in patronage and the shift in the ideologies of what an elite should be. The shift from an imperial elite to a modern middle-class elite, which I think is absolutely crucial to understand to understand in terms of the larger trajectories of Indian cultural histories in the 20th century. So that I think is actually the larger story to be told. What does the Bombay cinema, this birth of Bombay cinema, have to tell us about the larger kind of modern Indian history? It's not just about cinema that we are talking about here, but what happens in cinema is a symptom of a much larger and crucial shift that is worth thinking about at length, because not much has really been thought about except for the understanding that there's a shift in patronage from zamindars and princes in, say, classical music, for example, towards a modern state patronage of these arts. But I think the implications of this shift are huge in a certain sense. I'd like to end by saying that the bazaar remains resilient. There was an attempt through the 1950s and 60s to tame it, but it's back with a vengeance, and it's back now even with a greater vengeance. You just have to look at the OTT series set in small town India, they're all set in bazaars. Or if you think about the mafia film set in Bombay in the 1990s and 2000s, they're all set in the bazaars of Bombay. The bazaar remains as stubborn to any state control or any logic of history which can be imposed from above. Things leak in and out. It still remains a global cosmopolitan sphere of faction which is hard to tame. I think it's that spirit that I catch at a certain point in time, very early on in the 20th century. Thank you.